Hi. After listening to Samuel berate the Israelites for having chosen a king as sin, rebellion, and idolatry, practically, we now come to the actual reign of Saul in 1 Samuel 13 to 15. We've been looking at 5 chapters now where the question of monarchy has been considered. I wouldn't raise it to the level of debated because hardly is there a back and forth. It's a people's request, it's Samuel's resentment, it's Yahweh's accession, and then it's Samuel fighting against it most of the way up until now, and he's going to continue to fight against it in the particular case of Saul, as we'll see later in this chapter, and we'll also see in chapter 15. So now the theoretical question discussion is over, and now the issue is going to be what is it actually like to have a king in general, but more specifically to have Saul in particular. Because plainly in the narrative, which I can't really imagine too many listeners, even if you're not familiar with the Bible, will be surprised by, Saul will be replaced by David, who will certainly be popular and will lose the question of whether having a king was a good idea or a bad idea, since the Star of David is on the national flag of the nation of Israel to this day, and in Hebrew, Mogen David is a brand name and a very popular way of talking about Jewish pride. National pride especially. So the question of monarchy in general tends to fade away, and all this discussion in chapters 8 to 12 get replaced by the discussion of particular people, and the first one up, of course, is Saul. And one of the challenges that we've already looked at briefly is Saul was not wanting to be king. We know of no experience or training he has that make him ready to be king. He was a farmer pulling the oxen and the plow, and he successfully led the army that just came by muster, by threat of if you don't come, I'll kill all your oxen, against the Ammonites in chapter 11. But then Samuel renewed the kingship, as we saw, so-called, and threatened the people, and in fact carried out the threat with a thunderstorm on their wheat harvest. So the question of kingship has gone back and forth, and now it comes to Saul. I want to do several things here. We're going to look at the Hebrew in a minute, but if you haven't been watching the series of videos, I want to note where we are in the sequence in chapters 11 to 15. So now we're here, and we're only going to look at these 4 verses here because there are a lot of details going on that we need to pay attention to. But one of the questions as we go through these pieces here and what follows in chapter 15 is how to see this larger unit. The scholar J.P. Fackelman, who wrote 4 volumes of extensive detailed commentary on the books of Samuel using structuralist approaches, and it's very helpful. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get. Each volume is between $150 and $250 if you can get one, and even the library I use at my former academic institution, which has access to interlibrary loans, couldn't find them for me except for 1 volume. So it's one of the reasons I'm doing videos like this, to make things accessible to folks who don't have access. But even I, with scholarly resources, didn't have access to most of Fackelman's work. But I do for this section. So as we go through the rest of 1 Samuel, we'll have the benefit of some of his marks on this. And what he suggests is chapter 13 and 14 are divided into 3 pieces as follows. A triptych he describes with dark sides and a bright center. So the first part is 13, 2 to 22 that we're beginning to look at today, this first battle against the Philistines. The first part of 14 is Saul's successful battle, and then the second part is the lamented part where he threatens his own son Jonathan's life for having violated his oath to not eat until a victory was made. So that's one way to see that these 3 pieces are together, and many scholars, including Barbara Green and others we've been looking at and will continue to look at, note how chapter 13 and 14 are tightly connected. But I'd also like to have us look at these 3 chapters, if not in a formal structure that way, at least as a sequence of these challenges to Saul's leadership. So in chapter 13, we'll see that Saul gets in trouble for failing to follow Samuel's instructions. They're presented as Yahweh's instructions or commandments, and when we get there, we'll look at what scholars have done in detail, arguing every which way about what exactly Saul did that violated Yahweh's commandments. But it's, if nothing else, at least Samuel's commandments, and it had to do with not offering sacrifice until Samuel got there. So he was told not to do something, and he got in trouble for doing it rather than not doing it. Then in chapter 14, he gets in trouble over his son Jonathan not following Saul's instructions. Saul gave instructions to the entire people not to eat until the victory was won, and Jonathan hadn't heard the instructions, and so when he was hungry, he dipped his stick into some honey and ate some honey, and his eyes were brightened, and Saul threatened to kill Jonathan over that after Lot was taken to find who it was, and the people protect him. And so Saul gets in trouble there for somebody else not following his instructions. So you see the contrast between 13 and 14, where Saul gets in trouble for not following Samuel's instructions, and now Saul gets in trouble for Jonathan not following Saul's instructions. Notice it's not Jonathan who ends up in trouble, it's Saul who ends up in trouble. So a very difference in the power of Saul's instructions versus Samuel's instructions. And finally, in chapter 15, Saul will get in trouble again for failing to follow Samuel's instructions. In that case, to not keep any alive. And he will keep alive King Agag of the Amalekites and some of the sheep as well. And he'll blame it on the people. But you see, I hope you see the pattern I'm naming here. That in the first one, Saul gets in trouble for not following instructions not to offer sacrifice. In the second one, he gets in trouble for a violation of his order not to eat. And the third one, he gets in trouble for failing to follow Samuel's instructions not to keep anything alive. So each of these has to do with obedience or disobedience, but Yahweh is not directly involved in any of this. Scholars tend to follow Samuel, not all though, and assume that Samuel is Yahweh's authentic spokesperson because of Yahweh's responsiveness to the call for a thunderstorm on the wheat harvest. But we don't hear Yahweh speaking here, and so it's ambiguous. So whether we look at it from Pockelman's triptych of chapters 13 and 14, or my suggestion of a sequence of 3 themes throughout the 3 chapters, we're going to see how the text shows us Saul failing to be the kind of king that the Israelites are happy with, and that more importantly that Yahweh is happy with, leading to his replacement by David. So today we're just going to look at these first 4 verses here. And already in verse 1 we have some challenges, and so I'm going to bring up the Hebrew this time that I haven't brought up in a while, although I expect very few of you can read Hebrew, but there's an interesting issue here, both about the Hebrew and how people read, and that's what I want to bring up here. So the New Revised Standard, as you can see on the left, says Saul was, and then there's an ellipsis, blank years old when he began to reign, and he reigned blank, and 2 years over Israel, which obviously makes no sense in English whatsoever. So I brought up a almost random series of translations. This is just off Bible Gateway, and the first ones that come up alphabetically. So you can see some of the ranges of the problem here and how different readers of different translations get very different ideas. So here he reigned 1 year. When he'd reigned 2 years, whatever's going on there. Here he's 40 when he began to reign, or was he 30 when he began to reign? And we see several of those. Was he 40 and he began to reign for 2 years, or only when he reigned 2 years? Or was he 30 and he reigned a total of 42 years? Or was he 40 and he had reigned 2 years? That one's similar. Was he 30 when he became king and then he reigned 42 years after that? In other words, it's a mess. And as Jobling says here, the sorry state of 13:1, which is to say the Masoretic text in the Hebrew, is an initial marker of the direction Saul's fortunes will soon take. In other words, he's taking the bad Hebrew there as an expression of either intention or just coincidence that replicates that Saul's history as king in these chapters is as jagged and fractured as the Hebrew of the first verse. And Sumora, who's a very careful reader, notes here one option here. He says the term 1-year-old usually refers to an animal, and I'll bring up the Hebrew again just so you can see that there, even if you can't read it. This here refers usually to an animal. Reigned 2 years, but the 2 is misspelled here. This is not the usual spelling. And we know in the narrative that Saul's reign is longer than 2 years, raising the possibility that 2 years is Yahweh's perspective on Saul's reign. That's a reasonable guess on Samora's part, and most scholars don't even go that far. He was writing a big detailed commentary. Most scholars just skip over it as it doesn't make any sense. But the scholar Biro went deeper, and I really like this because we're going to look at Meyer Sternberger on the question of Hebrews in verse 3, and we'll see it again in verse 7, who wrote a whole long book, over 900-page book, highlighting what happens when scholars give up on reading carefully and either assume sources or just assume their own presuppositions. So what he goes through here, and I'm not going to show you this in detail, he argues, and this is the quote from him you can see in the lower left, there is a sophisticated pun being woven by the narrator, and that the sophistication of the pun is responsible for it being lost on successive generations. And what he argues here is that the Hebrew Ben Shana here, which we see here, Ben Shana, after surveying many languages' interpretation of this, suggests it's an expression of Saul's childlike nature, because he says the pun is rooted in this root here, which is very close to what we see here in the root, which can mean change into insanity. Thus Saul was insane when he became king. And then he continues, the pun couches the statement about Saul's state of mind in the form of the expected regnal formula. In other words, it's a very standard thing. We see it throughout First Kings, and we see it around David, of starting the narration of somebody's reign or ending it with how long they reigned, a standard regnal formula, common to many cultures, of course. And what Byro's suggesting here, as reading closer, is that the Hebrew's a wordplay, and yes, there's something about age, but he was insane when he began to reign. And whether we take that as the actual, quote-unquote, actual meaning of the text, or just what happens when you read more closely, I really encourage readers to note that. If you're not used to reading carefully and you're used to just reading a passage, like we read anything in English off the internet and scan through it, note how much we can miss, and we can miss some of the most important part if we do. So after that first verse, we're only going to look at 3 more verses, and I can bring them all up on the screen at the same time today, so we can see it all pretty much at the same time. So it says, Saul chose 3,000 out of Israel immediately. We don't know why. There's no apparent threat. He's just doing that. And that detail, along with another detail, blowing the shofar there, the trumpet in verse 3, suggests that Saul is modeling himself on the judges, but not quite. So let's look at it a little more closely, and then we'll look back at a couple of texts from Judges that echo sort of. So Saul chose 3,000 out of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home to their tents. So a lot going on there. So let's look at a couple of examples of judges choosing people from the book of Judges. First, Deborah in Judges 4:6. We hear this. Deborah sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. So there you see, calling a muster by tribes. And similarly, we see this in Judges 20 in the infamous scene about fighting the Benjaminites over the death of the concubine in Gibeah. We hear this, but now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. We will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, to bring provisions for the troops who are going to repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the disgrace they have done in Israel. So in both those examples from Judges 4 and Judges 20, we see judges going around and selecting people from the tribes as an expression of tribal loyalty and solidarity. But here Saul doesn't know anything about tribes, and there are a couple of issues around that. Benjamin is obviously being mentioned, but not called a tribe. It's simply called Benjamin. And maybe it's the only one he knows. Maybe he doesn't know of other tribes. Maybe the authors don't know of this tribal history because it hadn't been determined yet. Maybe that's a way that Judges is later. It's hard to know which was first there. And certainly there's so many echoes of Judges and Samuel that it's really hard to imagine that Judges came after Samuel. But for whatever reason, Saul doesn't do it by tribes. He does it simply by Israel here. And notice it's a small number. He chooses 3,000 when he went out against the Ammonites back in chapter 11 with the threat of, if you don't come after me, I'll have all your oxen killed. He gathers more than 100 times that many, 370,000, and wins the battle. Why does he choose only 3,000? Does he just think that's enough? How would he know how much is enough? Again, he has no experience. And I really want to emphasize that. For all the scholars who want to chastise Saul for being somehow an immoral person or a rash person or some character defect, I really want to suggest all the way through that he's in over his head and it's not his fault. He didn't want to be king. He was forced to be king. The people are not sure if he's a melech, a king, or a nagid, something else, or a judge, a safet. So his title and his status and his role and the skills necessary are all ambiguous, and he has no one to guide him. So just to have some sympathy for the mess that Saul's in here. But he's trying to do his best, at least so far. So he chooses 3,000 out of Israel, and he puts 2,000 in Michmash, which means we need to pay attention to the map here, because so far in chapter 12, it's been mostly discussion. It's been not actual situations, and I hadn't been able to use my YouTube skills here to bring up other things. But now we're dealing with characters and places and events, so there'll be much more to bring up. So here's the area that we're talking about. Here's Michmash, here's Gibeah, here's Jabesh Gilead, where the battle against the Ammonites were, and they're home over here. And now we're looking this way to Philistines, although Philistines haven't been mentioned yet. They're obviously going to be, you can see, mentioned in verse 3, but not mentioned yet. So at the moment, it just seems like he's choosing soldiers for a potential army or perhaps a standing army. It's a rare occasion when soldiers are called when there's no immediate threat in mind. So we're going to see other places. It says 2,000 are with Saul in Mishmash and in the hill country of Bethel right here, and 1,000 are with Jonathan in their hometown of Gibeah. Although we don't know yet that Jonathan is Saul's son. We'll find that out later. So he's just named here out of nowhere, and we have no idea who he is. And we also have no idea why Saul is dividing his army between himself and with Jonathan, or why they're in two separate places. There's a lot that's not being told here. And then there's another bunch here. The rest of the people here, Yether here, a word only used a couple of times in Samuel, he sent literally to their tents. There's no word for home there. And that phrase, being sent to their tents, is one that will come up again, especially around the question of David's rule and potential rebellion against David, and also at the question of David's grandson Rehoboam's rule, the son of Solomon, and when Jeroboam, who leads Israel away from the monarchy in Judah by calling them to their tents, O Israel. So the call to their tents is still a reminder that these are nomadic people, or at least people not as settled as people in the classic four-room house that archaeologists discover in the hill country that are understood as standard Israelite houses over the years, over the centuries, in fact. So he's gathered this army of 3,000, split them into two groups here, and suddenly the action turns to Jonathan, away from Saul altogether. And so we're going to see some things about hearing here that are really important. There's a lot going on in this verse. So Jonathan, defeated is overstating the case. The verb here, nachek, can mean to smite or attack, but it doesn't necessarily determine the outcome. It's often used throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, not surprisingly in a text that's very involved with war and kings, over 100 times in the two books. But usually as the initiation or the continuation of a battle, not necessarily determining the outcome. And that's important that we hear that here, because the Philistines are not in any way defeated here. There's no evidence they are. In fact, they're going to make quite the comeback, as you can already see in verse 5 down below. So Jonathan decides simply to attack the garrison of the Philistines at Geba, and a lot going on there too. Notice he's at Gibeah. This is described at Geba, although some scholars suggest there aren't two separate places, that Geba is just another name for Gibeah. They're so close together that it probably doesn't matter much. But what matters here is the term for garret here, netzeb, which can mean a number of things. In English, we might tend to think of the garrison as being like a fort, like an array of soldiers who are camped in a certain place awaiting action. It can mean that, but it can also mean the governor or the prefect. In other words, the person who's the leader of a foreign army base. It can mean the post itself, like we might say a base, or it can mean a column or pillar, like a piece of a building itself, and a number of possibilities there. But in any event, as Fackelman notes in my note here, Jonathan commits an act of provocation which the enemy cannot fail to regard as a casus belli, which is to say he's initiating a war against the Philistines. The Philistines, though, we're told, are camping in their hometown, or at least in their immediate area. So this is Philistine territory over here. It's understood as a network of 5 cities of Gerar and Gath and Ekron and Gezer and Ashdod, Askelon here on the coast. If we look at it on Google Maps, we see something interesting about this, and worth doing, because the Philistines are a people famous or infamous for a variety of biblical and post-biblical aspects. So here we look at it from Google Maps, and we can see the coast cities here. But Philistine itself suggests that these are descendants of what scholars simply call sea peoples, whether that's the Phoenicians that had their headquarters in Tyre and Sidon and eventually colonized places as far as Carthage in North Africa and Gibraltar at the edge of the western edge of the Mediterranean. We can get a sense of that territory by tilting the map this way and looking up and seeing up the coast to Lebanon, where we'd see Sidon and Tyre if we were to move into this area. So up in this area just south of Beirut, and then of course looking out across the Mediterranean. So sea peoples, and one of our best sources among many is the work of the Dothans, married couple here, the sea peoples, who've done an enormous amount of work on that. If that seems like too much for you, you can also just go to this page from the Society of Biblical Literature's publicly available forum at Bible Odyssey, where scholars give brief summaries that are accessible to ordinary people about some of the biblical places and contexts, as you can see, people, places, and passages. So here's one by Aaron Meyer on the Philistines and their cities. Important to know something about them, because there are a number of details told about the Philistines here, and one of the curious things is they don't have a king. Unlike the Israelites wanting to have a king to be like the other nations, the Philistines are never said to have a king. Here are a couple of archaeological pieces to give you some sense. They're famous for this bicolor pottery, so you can see this beautiful pottery here. And here's an image from the Philistines at war for a warrior. I was really trying to find an image of their iron-wheeled chariots, which we'll hear about their chariots very soon, but I could not find one anywhere. I guess there just aren't any left from the ancient world. There are other iron chariots from other places, but not ones I could link with the Philistines. So the Philistines are ready for battle, and it's really quite bold here that Jonathan and Saul, inexperienced both of them as far as we know, than the one battle that Saul was in against the Ammonites, are ready to go. So they provoke them here. They attack them there, and then we hear a triple hearing. The Philistines heard of it. Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear," and when all Israel heard. So a lot going on there, and we're going to do more on Hebrews later, but I just want to notice the aspects of the hearing here. So the Philistines heard of it. It didn't say they heard it. They heard of it, which is to say a rumor that passes through. But there are questions about this sequence here, as Fackelman suggests that the line of hearing is inappropriate here. It divides up Jonathan's and Saul's. That's one way to look at it, and I'm not going to look at it in detail. My notes down below suggest this. I'll just read the quote from him so you can hear what his view is. He says, "It pulls apart the son's line and the father's line, and thus anticipates a dramatic estrangement which will rapidly develop between the king and his son. The budding conflict with a neighboring enemy is now beginning to drive father and son apart." That's one way to look at it, but I really want to look at Meyer-Sternberg's way of looking at it, and reference to this enormous but amazing book, Hebrews Between Cultures, which I read when it first came out a number of years ago. And I don't necessarily encourage folks to read it. Again, it's over 900 pages of closely argued narrative, and Sternberg has a certain style that people either like or hate. I happen to like it, but he makes a number of great points here, and what he mostly illustrates is how to listen closely, both to this and to Hebrews in just a second. So he says the three hearings do this. They unfold according to a scale of national propinquity. It modulates from the alien auditor, the Philistines, through the alienated Hebrews to the native worthy of the chosen ethnicon, Israel, revealingly doubling now as toponym, for the promised land itself hangs in the balance. That is to say, Israel the people and Israel the land. So the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet, which is to say the shofar, which is his second act of trying to be like a judge. If you're not familiar, here's the sound of a shofar. Not exactly like a metal trumpet, but as you can see from my note below, it became a standard issue in a couple places for leading people into battle in the Judges. So first, before the Judges, we see it in Joshua, as in the classic Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. So there the shofar is blown in Joshua chapter 6. But also in Judges 3:27, we see this from Ehud. "When he arrived, he sounded the shofar in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head." And similarly with Gideon, a few chapters later, we hear this: "But the Spirit of Yahweh took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the shofar, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him." So in both those cases with Ehud and Gideon, the blowing of the shofar is a muster of the army into battle. It never happens in the books of Samuel. The only use next in Samuel is in 2 Samuel for Joab blowing the shofar to call a halt to something. But never again does a king blow the shofar to lead people into battle. So again, it's suggesting that Saul is acting like a judge in how he chose the army and how he's blowing the trumpet. At least he's not threatening to kill their oxen. And then he says, "Let the Hebrews hear." And this brings up a big question at the heart of Sternberg's book. And I can't get into all of it now. I know this video is already a little long, so maybe I'll get into more of it when we look at verse 7 and see it again. And we'll see it also in chapter 14, where it all fits together. So just briefly, I want to note there are two schools of thought here. Maybe three schools of thought. One is that Hebrew is a word used by foreigners to talk about the Israelites, and yet that's not what's happening here. Saul's using it to talk about somebody. Another is that the Hebrew, for Hebrew, Evrim, is a corruption or variation on Abiru or some other variation of that from Akkadian or other Canaanite languages, suggesting a class of wandering, disaffected workers who may band together and rebel against local kings or be something like we may think of as terrorists or other disruptors. And that was certainly the argument that Norman Gottwald made famous in his classic 1979 book, The Tribes of Yahweh. But Sternberg takes issue with that, and I know many of my friends and many scholars I've relied on were big fans of Gottwald, who is no doubt a wonderful human being and a very generous scholar. But I'd like to suggest that I believe that Sternberg's view on this makes more sense of the data than Gottwald's, without any denigration of the greatness of Gottwald's work, and done over 4 decades ago before more recent methods revealed other ways of reading it. So Sternberg develops what he calls the Hebrew gram, and we'll look at that later, but he suggests that the question of what Hebrews means depends upon who's saying it. But here the point is there are 3 groups. They're the Philistines, there's a group called the Hebrews, and they're not the same as Israel, as you saw in my last quote from Sternberg, an alienated group. So he's referring to people who may be former Israelites siding with the Philistines, or people he thinks are some kind of traitors, or at least reticent, that need to be called into battle. And so he's calling for them to hear. But we don't hear the Hebrews here. We heard that the Philistines heard, and now we hear that all Israel heard. Not the same as the Hebrews. I heard that Saul had, again, this is struck, not defeated, same word as we just saw in verse 3, the garrison of the Philistines. But we saw that Jonathan did it, and that's an issue here. Is the issue that Saul is trying to take credit for it, which would already be a strike against him, or is it the rumor mill? Is it simply that that's what Israel heard, even though the text tells us that Jonathan is the one who struck, and Saul isn't openly claiming any credit for it? So again, that depends upon whether we as readers are ready to jump on Saul negatively, or whether we're ready to give him the benefit of the doubt until the text makes clear that he's making a mistake. So it's not necessarily that he's taking credit, it's just that that's how rumors go, especially in the midst of battle. So Israel heard that Saul had attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and Israel had become odious, or literally stank. Their reputation has gone bad. The people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. But he just told them to go to their tents. And so who's doing this calling? It's a passive voice here, as Fackelman notes and others do. It's not clear who's making the call here to these people from their tents. Certainly what's at issue, though, is that Jonathan, having provoked the bear, now they have to fight. And Saul seems to be ready because he's got his 3,000 and he's blown the trumpet and he's ready to go. And they join Saul at Gilgal, which we know is just not far. We can go back to that map and see not far from where we heard, just in Gilgal over here. So the battle is set up, and we'll see what happens next time, whether Saul can act like a successful judge against the Ammonites or whether something else will happen. See you then. Bye-bye.